Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Reveal Digital's Independent Voices webinar on crowdfunding for open access digital collections. My name is Paola Marchionni and I work at GISC. I'm head of digital resources for teaching, learning and research. Before we start, just a couple of housekeeping things. I guess everybody can hear me clear. If you can't, just put something in the chat box. Excellent. And just a second thing before we proceed, if everybody could please mute the microphones, you'll find the icon of your microphone at the bottom of your screen in the center, and that will help us to keep the sound really neat and clear and to avoid any background noise. So excellent. I will introduce the speakers now. There's myself over there, and in a moment I will hand over to Peggy Glan, who is Program Director at Reveal Digital. Douglas Field after Peggy. Douglas is a Senior Lecturer in 20th Century American Literature at the University of Manchester, and my colleague Surina Bhatti from GIS Collections. So the agenda, I will give a brief introduction to today and basically why we are doing this project, and then I will pass on to Peggy, who will give a bit of background on Reveal Digital and their innovative cost recovery open access model that they're using on the Independent Voices collection. Douglas will then speak a little bit about the importance of resources like Independent Voices from a researcher's point of view. The University of Manchester is one of the contributing institutions, so we're very grateful to Douglas for coming along to the webinar. And finally, Surina will explain how UK institutions can access Independent Voices, can gain early access, and how they can contribute to the project. We'll take questions and answers at the end, but I encourage you to put any questions that might come up as we go along during the presentations in the chat box, and then I will go through them and we will all try to address the questions at the end of the sessions. So why are we doing this? Well, as many of you will know, GISC, over the last 15 years, GISC has been actively involved in supporting democratic access to digital archival collections across both the higher and further education community through national purchases of commercially available resources such as EBO, ECHO, some resources that have now become really part of the scholarly process and practice, but also through the supporting high-profile and large-scale digitization projects, such as the one at the British Library, the 19th century newspapers, the Sound Archive, working in collaboration with many institutions. And we've also conducted a number of studies over the year that have provided us with quite a lot of evidence of the impact of digital collections of primary sources on innovative research, teaching and learning. And a study that we've done recently with ProQuest, the impacts of digital collections, concluded that digital collections have become fundamental to modern scholarship. However, times are changing and we're all operating in a tougher economic climate. GISC's own business model has changed, and so has our ability to support large-scale national purchases or digitization activity at the same level as we could do in the past. At the same time, our member institutions, yourself, have been telling us that library budgets are stretched. Often it is the arts and humanities that tend to be squeezed out when it comes to provision of digital content. Against this background, however, there may be some opportunities, and this is really what we've set out to explore through the collaboration with Reveal Digital. So, for example, are there new models that we can look at that can help us support sustainable digitization and delivery of special and archival collections beyond what is currently done by commercial publishers or through the limited availability of external funding that is accessible to institutions? Also, while the open access movement has made substantial progress in the context of research outputs, providing open access to digital collections in a sustainable way is still a challenge. And yet we know that when content is available on open access, it simply gets used more. So can we reconcile the open access with sustainability? We recently carried out a survey of academics to identify what priorities for digital resources, and one of the interesting priorities that came back that emerged was that to increase digital access to print publications from the 20th century, especially around social movements, feminist movements, and alternative movements. So the Reveal Digital's Independent Voices initiative, with its cost recovery and open access model, seemed an ideal candidate to explore some of these issues and how perhaps a community-based approach might work in the UK too, inspired by the success of Reveal Digital in the US. So we launched this collaboration back in last January 2017. So where we are now is that since then, a number of institutions have joined this project. Here they are: Birkbeck, Bristol, UCL, Manchester, Sheffield, Sussex, who had already pledged for independent voices back in the summer, University of York, and the University of the West of England. And part of the agreement that we stipulated with Reveal was that 50% of any contributions that were raised by UK institutions would go towards a fund to then digitize more UK content that is complementary to independent voices and which can then be added to the collection. So I'm very pleased to say that we have now set up the first meeting for the contributing institutions in July to discuss our plans for digitization and to get the help and the direction into content selection and sort of prioritizing the project. So this is where we are now, and I think I will now hand over to Peggy to talk a little bit more about Reveal Digital.
Well, thanks for that fantastic introduction, Paula. It's always so good to hear that the needs that are emerging in the UK are coming together at the same time, that our model is really starting to take shape, and it just seems like an ideal time for us to be working together. So just appreciate that and the support that we've had so far. The future is very exciting. To get started, last November, we had a good number of people join us for a similar webinar in which we introduced our open access model and this independent voices collection in particular. Douglas Field, who is the scholar that Paula gave the introduction for, attended that event. And at the point that we were talking with the JISC about this, Doug was also in the midst of working on a plan to digitize little magazines held by the University of Manchester. So what we are doing was of significant interest to him at the time, and certainly vice versa. It was just a great coming together. So in this follow-up webinar, Doug has offered to talk about what he is doing with his research and how the little magazines in particular that are part of Independent Voices have helped his work. And I think Doug's presentation will be, and I hope it'll be, both interesting on a personal level and insightful on a professional level for all of us who, if you're a librarian, we don't often hear from faculty, and it's always just such a pleasure when we have that opportunity. Before we do hear from Doug, I think you will find it helpful to have some context to understand Reveal Digital as an organization and our first project, Independent Voices. So let me just take 10 minutes to go over the highlights, and then I'll turn this over to Douglas. Let me go back here. You can think of Reveal Digital as an open access publisher, but it may be even more appropriate to describe us as a facilitator of library publishing programs. What I hope this graph conveys is that Reveal Digital functions as a hub for publishing activities, such as surfacing ideas for new collections, clearing rights, doing the digitization work, managing the hosting, and doing the fundraising that necessarily goes with this. So to do these things, we work primarily with 3 categories of people. And starting at the top, you'll see a box for special collections librarians. So we work with special collections librarians and archivists to identify content in their collections that are likely to have wide interest from other campus research groups. We're particularly interested in building collections that are sourced from multiple libraries, so we can create something new that libraries can't easily do on their own. On the right, you'll see a box for rights holders, and that's there because we've chosen to work with material published in the 20th century. So rights clearance is an important function that we perform. Once a project is defined, we at Reveal Digital do the detective work to identify the rights holders for publications we want to include in a collection, and then approach them to seek open access rights. And then on the left are the collection development librarians. Now, collection development librarians typically control the spending libraries do to acquire new content, and they also determine what open access programs their institutions are going to support. So when we approach these librarians, they evaluate our funding requests on the basis of spending money to acquire new content, or they often evaluate the request in light of their strategy to invest in open access programs. And sometimes they're looking at both. So I hope what you're seeing here is that our approach is highly collaborative, not only between many different institutions, but between different groups within the same institution. And Reveal Digital is the hub that provides the expertise to facilitate this collaboration, ensuring projects move forward and are sustained over time. The end result, or this bottom box here, are open access digital collections that support research in the humanities with a particular focus on 20th century society. Now, this diagram above could probably just as easily reflect the business model of traditional publishing. So you may be wondering, how is Reveal Digital really different? Well, there are a lot of answers to that question, but I think the key answers lie in how the costs are covered and to whom the content is made accessible. Publishing of any kind, whether it's traditional or open access, can and is often a costly undertaking. Traditional publishers, on top of just the costs, expect to earn sometimes 60 to 70% profit margins over the lifetime of a product. They expect to generate ongoing revenue streams for many years with no intention to open access to anyone who hasn't paid. Through Reveal Digital's open access model, we aim to be completely transparent about costs, and our goal is simply to recover those costs. Now, this graph here shows the projected costs for the Independent Voices collection. And as you can see here, open access is definitely not free by any means. But once costs are covered, we are able to open the collection to everyone. Another important area where we are different from traditional publishers is we claim no ownership of the content we digitize. The digital assets belong to the rights holders and the libraries and archives that own the original source material. So what motivates all these groups of people to get involved with Reveal Digital? Move to the next slide. Our approach benefits a lot of different stakeholders in numerous ways, but I think the most obvious benefits may be to the libraries who hold the source material. Under our model, the source library owns the digital files we create for a project, and they retain complete control over those files in any future use. A source library's content is digitized at no direct expense to them, so the costs are paid by the pool of funding libraries. Perhaps less obvious but still important is that the content from one library is aggregated with the content from many others. This ensures the content will be more discoverable and more useful than if a single title or smaller collection resided in isolation on its own. And maybe the biggest question in your mind in terms of who benefits and why they would participate would be, why would a library pay for something that will ultimately be open access? Well, as we've talked to libraries about our approach, many of them, the librarians that we speak to, realize that if they do not support an open access of content that's a collection of content that's of value to them, a commercial publisher is likely to also recognize that that content is valuable and will publish it, but at a much higher price, potentially 30 to 50% higher. So it is in a library's economic interest to participate. But we do offer some perks to libraries that help with funding. Funding libraries get immediate access, early access to digitized collections before they are made open. Our collections are made open access when they are complete, but that process can take sometimes months, and in the case of independent voices, several years. So there are some real advantages to that early access. Libraries are increasingly supporting text and data mining projects, those requests from researchers, and they're asked to provide large corpora of content. While funding libraries can request text and metadata downloads from the collections they help to fund at no charge. And they can do that as many times as they wish. Also, MARC records and usage statistics are provided only to funding libraries. These things aid discovery and help with collection analysis throughout the life of a collection. And finally, funding libraries are able to nominate content from their own collections that may not have been included in the original scope. Now, there are other stakeholders here that benefit as well. The rights holders are big beneficiaries of what we're doing in many cases. It is, if you think about it, the rare publication archive for which access can be sold to earn enough money to cover the cost of doing the original digitization. So by participating in our projects, publishers are able to have their content digitized at no cost to them. They receive the digitized files back to do with whatever they wish. Also, by being included in a larger project, their content is actually more likely to be discovered and used. But ultimately, it is the scholars and researchers that are the beneficiaries of Reveal Digital's model. It is they that will have access to more content from any place in the world than will ever be possible under traditional publishing models. So now that you have hopefully a conceptual idea of what Reveal Digital is doing, let's focus on our first project called Independent Voices. Independent Voices is a collection of 1960s, 70s, and 80s alternative press publications, primarily at this point from the US and Canada. It currently contains 441,000 pages, but when complete, it will contain approximately 750,000 pages from around 1,000 titles. Now, most of this content has never been digitized. Alternative press publications just were not widely collected by libraries at the time, so it's rare for any one library to have an entire run of any of these titles, and no library collected all of the titles we're bringing together. By collaborating with many libraries, we are able to create complete runs of titles in a digital format and provide a more holistic perspective of the era than has ever been done before. Independent Voices is composed of 9 series covering publications that come out of the major social movements of North America at the time. You can see the list of 8 of the 9 series here. The one that's missing is the Right Wing Press series, and that's not listed because we're just beginning copyright clearance work on this material, so no digitization has been done yet. Now, our focus with the rest of this webinar today with Douglas's presentation is on the literary magazines, often referred to as little magazines. Independent Voices contains, I think, the largest collection by far of digitized little magazines. It is a real treasure trove. This content may seem out of context, but it really isn't. The little magazines reflected the social movements active at the time, mostly through experimental and avant-garde poetry. Independent Voices, for that reason alone, is a must-have for anyone studying contemporary poetry and its social context. If you want a full description of this, I encourage you to go to our website. There's the address is here on the slide. And here you will find quite a bit of information about the entire collection and what we're doing. You'll be able to see a list of funding libraries that have provided funding so far. We're up to 113 and still growing, including the 7 UK institutions that Paula mentioned earlier. Support for our model and the Independent Voices Project is widespread across the US and Canada. If you look at this list, you will see many libraries you would expect to see, like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, University of California libraries, but you'll also see many small liberal arts colleges you may never have even heard of, like Allegheny College or Reed College or Kalamazoo. Equally important is the involvement of libraries that hold the source material we need for the collection. So far, 37 libraries, archives, and individuals have provided source material for digitization. Without these partners, the collection could not exist, so we're very grateful to them. With this background, I think I'm ready to turn the presentation over to Douglas, and if you have any questions, I look forward to answering those in the Q&A part of the session that follows. So I'll hand this over to you, Douglas. I think you'll find the screens advance a little more slowly than you might think, but if you hang with it, it'll go.
Thank you, Peggy, and good afternoon to everybody. Apologies, I have a slight cold. It's hotter than the Bahamas in Manchester, UK, but it's I somehow have a sort of end of term cold, so bear with me. As Paula mentioned, I was at the webinar in November, and I was very interested in the ways that JISC, Reveal Digital, working together to digitize little magazines in particular. And it coincided, as was mentioned earlier, with a project that I'm working on. Some magazines at Manchester, but mainly at University College London's very significant collection of little magazines. So I'm going to say a little bit about my experience as a researcher. So primarily as a scholar working on little magazines from 1960 to 1980, I'm working on a large collection of essays, which is a cultural and critical history of little magazines from this period, but also as a scholar of African American literature. My previous books have been on the African American writer James Baldwin, and there are particular digitized content that has been very useful for that as well. So little magazines, as I'm sure you know, were usually self-published. The collections are scattered. They're very ephemeral. It's very hard to find a complete run. For one example is Jeff Nuttall's My Own Mag, which ran from 1963 to 1967. There are 17 copies, which is quite unusual for a little magazine. There are only, to my knowledge, 3 examples of a complete run. One has been digitized on another website, it's sort of free of charge. Another is in a private collection, and there's one that I've, well, 2 are actually in private collections. So it's very, very hard, and had somebody not digitized and put online the complete run, we really wouldn't know much about it at all. Even when they are collected, these runs of little magazines, e.g. at University College London's archive of little poetry magazines, they're rarely catalogued. They do a great job there, but there are rarely enough resources for archivists and curators to catalogue them completely. So it's very difficult to find the material, even if you know it's there. And as was mentioned by Peggy, it's common to find incomplete runs of little magazines, meaning that the researcher has to visit several archives. Now, once upon a time, I didn't mind that before I had kids, and sort of 20s and 30s, I would go to different libraries across the United States. That was fine, but now it's not something I can do very easily. It's not something that a lot of people can do. And there are also reasons, I think, ethical reasons, environmental reasons for not wanting to do that as often. Ian Sinclair, in The Conductors of Chaos, writes that the plethora of original pamphlets and chapbooks cannot be located without a team of detectives and a hefty bank balance. The point being that the whole episode was strictly off-piste, unnoticed, a cottage industry inspired and operated by the poets themselves. What Sinclair's saying, I think, is very interesting and sort of absolutely kind of encapsulates some of the problems with this. So these are pamphlets and chapbooks which weren't intended to be collected. Often they're in the hands of private collectors. There are certain websites that you can go to and you can, like Test Center, where you can see them being sold. Very few libraries acquired them from the 1960s. So in a sense, one of the things that Independent Voices does is they've done the detective work for you, and the hefty bank balance isn't needed as much because the costs are shared out amongst different institutions. So in my experience, as a researcher and scholar, and also for the enthusiasts, I think this is very important that because it's open access, that people, and this is something that's very important to me, that enthusiasts who aren't affiliated to an institution can access the material. This is particularly important, I think, because many of the most knowledgeable people that I've come across are enthusiasts who aren't necessarily scholars, but nonetheless they've been collecting this material, some of them for decades, and know much more than the academics. So this collection offers an unprecedented insight into the development of little magazines, and really, in many ways, for the first time, we can actually chart the cultural and critical history. And crucially, they're fully searchable. I was really amazed. I had a trial offer, and I was amazed how easy it was to search, and to search very well. And if it sounds like I'm being paid by JISC and Reveal Digital, I'm not. I'm just an enthusiast. I find it extremely useful. And the issues are scanned, allowing viewers to zoom into detail that might be lost to readers of the hard copy. This again is something which I find very exciting. I've experimented with on an exhibition I did recently with Jeff Nuttall's material, where we had a similar idea where we scanned copy into a large tablet that you could zoom into, and it was extremely useful. I like the ways that the full copies are scanned, so you can see all the ephemera. You can see where previous libraries had perhaps attached something to them, the staples, that kind of thing. You can see that get a sense of the materiality of the little magazines as well. So seeing full runs of little magazines enables scholars and enthusiasts to see patterns in terms of form and style, developments of experimental poetry, for example, as well as seeing the network of contributors. It's possible to then create digital network maps, to do text mining, to see patterns and networks in hitherto unprecedented ways. I'd also mentioned that the search functions work extremely well. You can search through the entire collection or limit your search to individual publications. So if you're, for example, if you're looking at William Burroughs published in numerous little magazines during this period, you can quickly and very easily see where those were. Just a couple more slides. I think the collection of little magazines is timely. It feeds into growing interest in print and material culture. As Sean Latham and Robert Scholes observed about a decade ago, the humanities has experienced a growing interest in periodical studies, a phenomenon they credit to the cultural turn, as they call it, in departments of language and literature. And while there's been substantial scholarship on little magazines prior to 1960, there's little work on the Mimeo revolution, as it is described, in reference to the mimeograph machine, which many little magazines were made, but not all. As Christopher Harter notes, much of the focus on little magazines has been on the modernist era of Pound and Eliot, adding that scholarship on little magazines is just beginning to address the significance of little magazines that originated during the era of the mimeograph revolution. So in terms of the scholarship and stuff that I'm interested in, it's very, very timely as well. And finally, just as I wanted to mention another facet to the collection. This is Freedom Ways, which is, as I'm sure you know, a leading African-American political and theoretical journal that ran from the 60s to the 80s. Contributors included Alice Walker, James Baldwin, who's a particular interest of me, C.L.R. James, and Nikki Giovanni. Until now, it has been very hard to find a complete run of this important journal. So I've got several colleagues at the University of Manchester who are building courses around the fact that these complete run has been digitized. Thank you very much. I will now stop. And
Brilliant. Thank you, Douglas. Now, I'm just going to run through a couple of slides of how to pledge. So we have pledging fees agreed for UK institutions for the independent voices. It's according to GIST bands, the fees. It's a one-off contribution, so there will be no recurrent costs at all. Now, the current cut-off date for the pledging period ends on the 31st of July, so we've got a few weeks left. Now, half of the amount pledged by UK institutions will go towards the digitisation of the UK material for inclusion in the independent voices. And how to pledge. So UK institutions, you can pledge by going on to the GIST Collections catalogue page for Reveal Digital, accepting the terms of the licence in order to pledge. Now I'll pass over to Paula.
Thank you, Serena. So this is all from now. These are some links that you might find useful. So this is the link that to the GIST Collections page that Serena just mentioned. If you have any queries about trial access or any of the information on how to access the collection, you can get in touch with our help desk. For anything else, you are very welcome to email me, and then I can get in touch with others of my colleagues who have spoken, and whom I would like to thank very much, Peggy, Doug, and Serena. So I don't know if there are any questions. Please feel free to either put them in the chat box, or if you have a microphone, you can just click on the raise hand icon, and you can speak. I don't think I've got any questions. Yes, okay. Any
Paula,
future
before
planning
you
for
jump into that, I wonder if I could, since I have the microphone turned on, if I could ask a quick question of Douglas. Douglas, you mentioned text mining, and that's an area where we're starting to hear more and more about, but it's still kind of new to a lot of people. Have you done any projects using text mining yourself, or have you worked with other scholars who have been that you can just talk a little bit about?
I've done a form of data, sort of text data mining, which is, sorry, I'm just turning something off, which I did. So I mentioned Jeff Nuttall, and I was very interested to see in his archive there are I think 671 items, letters, manuscripts, etc. So I wanted to produce a digital network map which would show, will give a description of the content, but also would link all the contributors and people mentioned there, so all the correspondence. So I got some funding. I mean, I'm not technically very kind of savvy, but I got some funding for someone to write a particular piece of software that enabled us to create a digital network map. And one of the exciting things about that is that it's like, I kind of see it a bit like a sort of 3D database, where rather than data, but you can use it as a straightforward database. You can tap in and see who's mentioned there in the collection, but then you can use filters, so you can see how many people from United States, Belgium, etc., mentioned, how many women. It's very striking how few women there were in his collection from the 60s and 70s. So those are some of the things I've done. There are other models out there, things like Gephi that people use, and there's a lot of open source material, programs rather, that can be used.
Okay, thank you, Douglas. There was a question from Heta, and I think it may have been directed to you, Peggy, in terms of any plans for linguistics or rare languages collections. So
I'd say we have a couple of new areas that we're exploring here. We have a new project that is focusing on the newspapers that were published by Ku Klux Klan organizations in the United States in the 1920s. There was a resurgence of Klan activity during that period that was certainly still focused on African Americans and that where you normally associate sort of Ku Klux Klanism, but they were also very much anti-immigrant. So that was included people who were immigrating from Europe and had Catholic backgrounds or had Jewish backgrounds. So there was a lot of language and rhetoric and things that emerged during a very brief period of time. There was one newspaper, sort of the national newspaper of this group, that had a larger publication, if you can believe, or publication base of larger than the New York Times. So it was at that time a very active movement, but it was brief, fortunately. But there were a lot of newspapers published that we'll be capturing, digitizing, and making open access. That's really the first project under a new fund that we're creating. It's called the Diversity and Dissent Digitization Fund. And the goal for that fund will be to find collections and publish them around this idea of civil society in 20th century Western culture. So we'll be looking at projects that are similar to Independent Voices and to this Ku Klux Klan project that I talked about, where it's exploring social movement, social change, diverse voices of dissent, all within sort of the 20th century. So while we aren't really looking at this point at kind of rare languages and linguistics kinds of things, if that's an area where we see a need emerge, then we could create a different fund that would have a different name and begin trying to gather funding from libraries to support digitization in that area. I hope that answers the question. Let me know if you have any follow-up.
Thank you, Peggy. I think there's another question, but I think Serena also wanted to just say something about trial access.
Sorry, yes. Thanks, Paola. Yes, I forgot to mention there is a free trial available for the Reveal Digital Independent Voices. So you can go onto the GIST Collections catalogue page to select the free trial option, or contact Peggy directly, who'll be able to sort you out for the free trial to explore the collection.
Thank you. There's another question here about from Ewan Franklin about plans to source and digitize UK content. Yes, so these are, we are at the very beginning. So the model that we would like to follow for this is very much inspired to the work that Reveal Digital has done in the US. So our plan is to involve first and foremost the contributing institutions so far. So we have a meeting in the diary in July that will be the first meeting, and as you can imagine, there will be a lot of issues to look at, and trying to develop criteria for for how to go about selection. I think we will start by looking at what the institutions might have as collections, and if not, what other collections might be identified beyond the contributing institutions. Obviously, we'll have to take into account issues about the amount of funding that we managed to raise. I'm pleased to say actually that GISC has committed to match fund what has been crowdfunded from the libraries so far. Even so, it's nothing in the range of what the kind of large-scale digitization projects we used to do up until a few years ago. It's not in the range of hundreds of thousands of pounds, but we believe that we can still make an impact. And just sort of referring to what Douglas was saying before, even just reuniting virtually some of these magazines of titles can be very impactful for researchers. So yes, we're just starting now, but if you have any more specific comments or suggestions, then by all means just get in touch with me, and we can take this offline. There was then another question about the relationship between creating digital archives and expertise. I'm not sure if there was any particular aspect of this, but I don't know, Peggy, if you want to say a few things about your approach with the Reveal Digital collections.
Yes, James brings up a really good point. Reveal Digital is not the expert. We don't have people on our staff who are PhD people in these various different social movements and areas of interest. So we are depending on working with experts in those areas to help us shape these collections. Now, you notice that we had the GI Press is one of the series within Independent Voices, and James is the man, probably the most knowledgeable person in terms of the GI Underground Press. And so we used his expertise to shape that collection. In the area of feminist studies, we worked with a woman particularly at Duke University who is in charge of the Sally Bingham Center there. So she's very expert in that particular area. So as we're developing new collections, we will be looking to have, as part of our sort of formal organization on an editorial board we are forming now, we'll have, including on that board, experts in these various different areas. And as we identify new collections, we'll want to make sure that we have sort of boards covering those different collections where we can draw on the knowledge from within the institutions that are supporting this. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Peggy. Yes, I should probably clarify as well that this is very much the approach that we've had at JISC in terms of working with institutions, but very much relying on the expertise that resides within and outside those institutions through advisory groups, academic advisory groups, people like Douglas and specialists, special collection librarians, and so on, to really guide the digitization. We are not subject experts at JISC either, so this is entirely what our approach will be for the UK side of things too.
Paula, there was an earlier question from Heta about files and hosting systems that I'll just talk very briefly about.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I saw it and then I lost it. Sorry, Heta. Go ahead, Peggy.
So we're trying to use very standard formats for all of the digitization work that we do. So when we're imaging, we're using TIFF images as the base, and we're delivering, I think it's JPEGs on our hosting system. The metadata is in a METS Alto format, so that's all very standard. It can be transformed as standards change and we need to upgrade to new things as time progresses. We'll be able to do that because we have started with very standard material. In terms of the hosting, we are using a system called Veridian. Veridian was started, I think, as an outgrowth of a newspaper digitization project in New Zealand. And it has grown to be a hosting system for many libraries in some in New Zealand, but certainly in the United States. So these guys know the library world, and they provide a very cost-effective, but I think useful and feature-rich platform on which we can operate. So we've got kind of the best of both worlds with them.
Okay, thank you, Peggy. Are there any more questions before we close? There isn't anything coming through the chat box, but that's the last opportunity for people to raise their hand or put something in the chat box. Okay. Well, if not, I think all is left for me to do is to thank very much our speakers, Peggy, Doug, and Serena. And again, for all of you for participating in the webinar. And if you have any questions, here are the key contact emails and web pages. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.